You're tuned to Radio Kidnappers, the voice of Hawke's Bay. This is a program called Real Wealth, and it's our pleasure, as always, to have in the studio Nick Stewart from the Stewart Group in Hastings. How you going, Nick?
Very good, thank you. Great to be here again.
Nick, you're now a YouTube star. Say good day to your audience.
Hello.
Now, the Stewart Group, before we get into today's topic, which is a bit of an unusual one, and I would never have thought about it myself, but just remind our listeners what the Stewart Group is all about.
Stewart Group is a family-owned Hawke's Bay business, and we provide financial services, investment, KiwiSaver, insurance to the financial needing public.
And you've been doing that for 32 years.
We have indeed, 32 years going strong.
That's a long haul.
Yeah, it is, yeah. When the average duration of a business is a little bit shorter than that, yeah, it's a good tenure.
Now, today you're going to talk about investing in wine.
Yes.
I never would have thought of that as a commodity.
Well, traditionally, yeah, a lot of people haven't, but it really came to life following the global financial crisis in 2008, where people were looking for, well, let's call it alternative assets. And quite a few people looked at the fine wine market as a means of getting diversified assets.
And is it a market that's growing, or when you invest, you know that you're going to get a good return, or it's just like a share, I suppose, is it?
Well, it's a mixture of a number of things. It's, look, alternative asset fads, let's call it one of those. They're quite common. I mean, people have recently just, parked a whole lot of money in Bitcoin, and if they took it off the table today, they'd have 50 cents in the dollar. I mean, people do chase alternative assets. The reason why I thought wine was an interesting one is that, we're in a wine growing province, 26 degrees outside today, harvesting is underway, but I just wanted to share with people the fact some of the pitfalls that come about by seeking out these unregulated alternative assets.
And what are some of those pitfalls?
Well, the pitfalls are, I've just got a couple of notes. So for example, you can buy wine in three forms. You can buy it from the winery directly, which here in Hawke's Bay we can. You can pop down to meet the winemaker, the viticulturalist, and buy it there, or you can buy it at auction. So there are a number of auction houses in Auckland and Wellington where you can buy wine, or you can buy on premier, which is where you pay a deposit on the wine today that is in barrel in, say, France, and in 2 years' time you take delivery, and you get a small discount because of that.
So actually buying the bottle and getting it delivered later on, is that what you're saying? Or?
Yes, yeah, that's right, but you normally, correct.
Yeah. So how do we make money on that?
Okay. So imagine that you're buying today some Mouton Rothschild, very famous wine in France, in Bordeaux. And let's say you're buying that at a discount today. You believe, due to the tastings that people have done from the barrel samples in the early days, people with far greater palates than yourself and myself.
Absolutely.
And you go with their wise guidance and expertise. You park down a small deposit, and in 2 years' time you take delivery of the wine, in the hope, if you're planning to do it for investment, that the wine has appreciated at that point.
Sure. So we're actually not talking, we're actually talking about the wine in the barrel which hasn't yet reached the bottle.
Correct, yeah.
As opposed to some fine French wine which might have been on the shelf for 20 or 30 years, getting better and better, and more people want to buy.
Yes, indeed. But the aspect you've got is that when you buy off, you have to ensure that the counterparty, the merchant, say, or the private seller, has looked after the wine, and that it's not an estate sale where in Uncle Arthur's sunroom, his dozen bottles of lovely French claret has been sitting there in the sun baking from 1 till 3 p.m. every summer day.
Yeah, quite right. It would be a major pitfall, wouldn't it?
Very much so, and it's as is where is with these things.
Yeah, I guess very much buyer beware.
Correct. Yeah. So look, you were asking about the pitfalls. So some of the pitfalls with en premier, and this is where a lot of wine is bought. And in the UK, they have a thing called a bonding program where you don't actually pay the duty until the wine has left the bonded warehouse. So a lot of large collectors offshore, they never actually take consignment of the wine directly. It's sitting in a VAT or GST or wet tax free alcohol tax, that's the term for wet tax, where the wet tax hasn't been charged yet. In New Zealand we don't have those same scenarios, so over here it arrives with us. But the risk with On Premier, and there was a big case in the US that I followed quite closely, and it was a US On Premier company that was called Premier Cru Fine Wines. It was run by a guy called John Fox. He was it was a wine fraud, 45 million US dollars in total, and it's where he was taking that deposit off you for the On Premier wine, but he never actually delivered at the end of the day.
All right, so someone lost that big time.
Yeah, they did. A lot of people across the world. There were. I'm aware of New Zealanders who bought wine On Premier through that particular Californian supplier, and they might have got the first year's worth of wine, but 3 years later they couldn't understand why the wine wasn't arriving.
Who's doing the investing, Nick? I mean, is it nickel and dime stuff? Is it someone like me who, if I was a drinker, I might buy a dozen bottles and get delivery? Or is it someone like a big hotel chain who's buying 20,000 bottles?
In New Zealand, it's a little bit smaller. There are some corporate players who get involved in that space, but offshore, it's big.
Yeah,
it's much bigger. Particularly in the Chinese market, there was a movie narrated by Russell Crowe, the famous New Zealander that the Australians like to claim as their own.
Right.
And it's a movie called Red Obsession, and it's talking about the obsession that the Chinese have with Bordeaux, with fine wines. New Zealand's had some spillover benefit of that, but over there it became really large to the extent where the drinking of fine wines, particularly Chateau Lafite, another Rothschild within the Rothschild stable, that's typically the favourite label, and there was a couple of cognac suppliers as well. And there are stories of people where in a restaurant they would buy the bottle, make it known that they'd ordered the bottle of Lafite. Yes. They would pour it out, and at the end of the night it would be unconsumed, not drunk. So it was around notoriety and that
show ponies.
Yeah, it was all about mana and prestige, which is just crazy. And then you've got the stories in the 1980s, started in the 1980s, where the Japanese were buying Bordeaux, and their favourite label was Petrus, another very expensive label, and they were drinking it pretty much straight on release, so not aged, and they were blending it with Coca-Cola as a cocktail. Okay, so look, whatever spins your wheels, but certainly that type of market has evolved, and you've got some serious Asian collectors of wine.
I see these names that you were talking about, Nick. They're just flowing off your tongue, just like that. You're obviously well associated with them. But I mean, are they big time business? I mean, is it the sort of deal that you might be suggesting to a customer who's coming through to the Stewart Group, because you're all about diversity?
Yes.
Would you be saying to a customer, hey, look, what about investing in some fine wine? Is it?
No. That's something we wouldn't do. Wine, along with Bitcoin, are prohibited asset classes for us as assigned by our investment committee, and I think we called our fiduciary guide, which is like a straitjacket that runs our investments. But we've always thought that it's better to enjoy wine for its drinking pleasure and allow your regulated, diversified investment portfolio and financial markets to do the work for you.
Would you find it's only investors who they're just buying fine wine, like the Bordeaux that you're talking about? I mean, from my limited knowledge of wine, is that you go to the supermarket, you buy a bottle of wine, regardless of what you pay for it. If you don't drink it within a couple of years, it's not much chop anyway, unless it's a good red.
Correct. The investment grade wine is for serious players. Yeah. And that's where, DRC or Domaine Romani Conti, that's $2,500 to $5,000 a bottle.
Wow.
That's, serious players. Some of the people that own it, I'm not a fortunate person to own that particular wine, but if I did, there would be a possibility that I may never even let it pass my lips. No. It's purely for investment, and these things are commonly traded. when these numbers get up to that type of level, and you've got things like there's a lot of label fraud. So that'll be where the with the paper, the corks, the weight of the bottle, being the glass, the capsule. It's fraudulent. People have fabricated these labels, corks. They're recycling bottles. You run the serious risk in this particular area. And there was a movie I watched the other night, which is very entertaining, and it's called Sour Grapes. And that one there, the person that had done the printing had misspelled the winery addresses and locations. So it was, a number of things that are coming to the market. There's a neat little saying that in Las Vegas each year, there is more 1945 Petrus sold than was made in 1945.
I love it.
And then there's another famous region, Châteauneuf-du-Pape in France. Well, if you look at the literage that is sold per bottle per year, there is more sold than was produced in the region.
Wow.
Which means that you've got people are filling cheaper, inferior juice into bottles and selling it under the label.
Which reminds me of a funny story when you mentioned that fine Bordeaux with Coke. Some friends of mine who are very much into wine, they sniffed the glass and sniffed the cork, and they came under my pad one day, and I filled up a couple of very nice bottles with country blend stuff out of a cask, and they looked at the bottles and they just loved it, and they said, look, we're going to go and get some. So I still have not told those friends of mine to this day that it was country blend. But what you were saying is that it's all about show, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And look, I was talking to some people the other day, and I was getting them to tell me about what they think about wine. These are serious people who love drinking fine wine, and they said, well, it's effectively art you can drink. You can taste the love from the winemaker, the soil, etc. It's social. It has emotional meaning. It appreciates in value. Limited stocks, because each year, as people drink those bottles, there's less on the market. So you've got supply and demand, and it's an alternative asset. But aside from those very emotive things and the prestige and the mana, there are some serious issues around it. Things like how are you going to store it? Where you buy it, how do you value it, say for insurance purposes. It's one thing that we often talk to clients, those that possibly are not in the wine, they're not into wine for investment, they're into it because they enjoy it, because of the social factors. But the fact is, if you have a person that has 15 to 20 dozen bottles of wine, which is not uncommon in cellars that I see, and you say to the person, well, what have you got that insured for? And they'll say to me, well, I don't, it's just part of the household contents. And I said, well, if you actually tally it up on a spreadsheet or even on a napkin, you'll find that the amount of wine there, can be $10,000 to $15,000. So, and it's commonly stolen. I mean, we've had a number of cases in New Zealand where library stock is where a winery has back vintages in their library, like their library of wine, so to speak, and a number of those have been targeted for theft. So look, ensuring these things is very important, and making sure that you've got up-to-date values.
Great point that you raised a little bit earlier there, and that is red wine or great wines appreciate in value. It's probably one of the few things that you can buy that's unlikely to drop in value, is it? Or do they go through phases like everything else? I mean, people love fine wine. They're always going to love fine wine. So are they prepared to pay premium most of the time?
People do pay a premium. Although, look, if we look at the New Zealand example of New Zealand labels, we've got many great wine houses locally in Hawke's Bay. And if you look at the prices at auctions, which I track frequently, just out of personal interest and curiosity, you do notice, phenomenal fluctuations at auctions. But I have noticed that there's been, possibly because New Zealand's in a purple patch at the moment financially, that a number of wines that were trading at auction for $85 to $90, you don't even get a sniff in now at $125. So there is buying support there.
It's a bit like hedge funds. I mean, I heard an article on the radio quite some weeks back that people were hedge funding apples, potatoes, because particularly overseas. Can we do that with wine?
Well, there are hedge funds specifically focused on the wine market. That is correct. Yeah, I've got some friends offshore that have been, when I mean exposed, they've had work in that particular space. In terms of your previous examples like potatoes and raw commodities, many of those are, you're talking about a commodity fund. Someone's just making a play on commodities. Yeah.
And we can do that on wine.
Yeah, and people do that, particularly out of Asia and the United Kingdom. Yes.
Is this set up mainly for connoisseurs of wine, people who actually like to sit down with their $500 bottle of wine and sip it and enjoy it, or is it for serious money makers? They want to make a bit of money as well.
From what I've seen globally with the really large players in this particular space, a lot of them actually do drink a lot of the wine themselves. Whereas I've met some investors in the United Kingdom who were using wine as a means of diversifying their portfolio. But you got to remember, I'm not hearing any word of that anymore because the prices of other alternative assets, mainstream assets such as, global equities have done so well. So sometimes I do think it is a little bit of a fad, but there always will be the tried and tested player that has a real passion for wine, just as there are of those who really enjoy their art, and they will hold a portion of their wealth in liquid assets of wine.
So if we decide that we're going to buy a wine in France and it's a Bordeaux, and at the moment we buy it at today's price, and in 4 years' time we get it at today's price. So even if the market crumbles between now and when it comes out of the
good luck.
The barrel, it's good luck.
You're up for it.
We lose the money.
Yeah, correct. That's right. Well, but then of course you can always just drink it.
Yeah, and you won't feel quite so bad about it.
Yeah, but look, those issues around those kind of on premier wine fraud. I was having a look over the last couple of days, and just only 2 weeks ago there was a £45 million scam in France, where people were bringing in wine, labelling it in another region that was a prestigious region, but they were bringing in cheap juice from an inferior region and selling it. This is an unregulated market.
I never would have even thought of doing that. How do you know? How can you protect yourself from that? So if I decide to buy from you and you're a reputable dealer, and then you think, look, this guy's never going to know. How can you protect yourself? You can't.
Well, it's very difficult. You have to be in the know, and you really need to be able to trust your counterparties, which is why some people will go directly to the wineries and will not buy at auction, because also the trading cost in buying at auction is very expensive. You and I may bemoan when we sell a house or a residential property or some other form of landed asset that we'll bemoan paying 3 to 4%. You're talking 20% under the hammer. For wine auction. So if you buy that wine and it's increased by 20%, you put it at auction, the auction house is going to take all the margin that you possibly had been thinking that you were banking in terms of profit.
Yeah, good point. I suppose the same goes for fine liquors like vodkas and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, very similar. And look, a lot of people buy whiskey, on premier in the barrel. But again, that particular market has also been plagued with issues where you may have 100 portions of a whiskey syndicate available for sale, and the unscrupulous vendor sells 110 of the 100 slots, because in 20 years' time when the whiskey's released, sadly they won't be here to clean up the mess.
No, that's right.
So look, there are lots of cases of that, and one of the most famous books for those that are interested is one called The Billionaire's Vinegar. A good friend and wine buddy of mine from Rotorua kindly lent me the book, The Billionaire's Vinegar, and it was about the world's most expensive wine bottle ever sold a couple of decades ago for £105,000, and it was bought by one of the Koch brothers. You remember the America's Cup? They actually, they won the America's Cup at one stage for the United States, and that was a bottle of wine that was reputedly acquired from a bricked up cellar in Paris by a man of now questionable reputation, a guy Hardy Rodenstock, and the bottles had on them TH and in a space then J. Thomas Jefferson, who was a phenomenal collector of Bordeaux back in the 1700s. And it turned out that bottle was a fake, because when examined, the stenciling of that THJ was done by a machine. Oh. Not by hand. And look, a couple of the cases as well, you've got where, for example, there was some magnums of Petrus, that one that I talked about, that the Japanese were blending with Coca-Cola. Yeah. So the Petrus, there were at auction a whole lot of 1921 Petrus magnums came up for sale. Now magnums are a double normal bottle, so 1.5 litres. Well, Petrus never made any magnums in 1921. So somewhere over that period, they were, someone had done a little Houdini and switcheroony, and they'd filled some more recent bottles and relabeled them. You also had, there's a famous Burgundy producer called Clos de la Roche, and there was a whole lot of bottles that came up in California for sale. They were the 1929 vintage. Now 1929 was a great Burgundy vintage. Well, that winery didn't start production until 1934. So, look,
so it's not for the faint-hearted, really, is it?
No, it's not.
And you really need to be either one, a connoisseur, or you need to know a bit about wine full stop, or you need to go and see someone before you actually buy it.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, but look, and it goes back to that thing that we talk to people about, these alternative assets, that, these are new markets. The data is really sketchy. There is some live data now around wine, but it's short dated. I mean, it's not going back decades anymore. No. Whereas, I can go back and get global large cap, being say S&P 500, Dow Jones Index, blue chip equities. I can get the data on those back to pre the Great Depression. I can go back to the early 20s. Yeah. And whereas with wine, people talk about these type of numbers, but they're plucking grass and throwing it into the air.
Yeah.
They don't actually know. It's not robust.
No.
And look, when you're making recommendations with people's hard-earned nest egg and tax-paid capital, it needs to be robust. It really does. I mean, if you want to, in the alternative asset space in New Zealand, we've been great for chasing alternative assets. Sure. Telecom calling cards, little stick figures from, giveaway merchandise, ostriches, possum farms,
exactly.
Angora goats was another big one.
They were big, weren't they?
Yes.
So someone coming to see you, and I know you don't deal in as a commodity yourself, not quite as risky as Bitcoin, but would you be saying stay away from that? Or?
Well, certainly I'll be staying away from Bitcoin, absolutely. But in terms of the wine, I think that it's more the personal, emotional value of the wine. And it's fine for people to have some of their wealth tied up in wine, but look, so long as it's only the amount that they personally are prepared to risk, that they have good cellaring facilities, they're prepared to have it insured, and they, at the end of the day, that they can drink it themselves and enjoy it, and look, allow their diversified, regulated, proper portfolio indeed. To actually power up their wealth long term.
That's the word, isn't it? Diversification.
Sure is, but not diversification for just the sake of that. It's actually going into things that are regulated, that that there are protections and mechanisms in place for the investors. Because at the end of the day, it's like liquidity. Liquidity is king, and it's not until you need liquidity that you realise how important that is. And whilst wine in its liquid form is simply that, it is liquid, it can be hard to realise. Yes, it can be hard to sell. Yeah.
Nick, it's just about out of time. Just remind our listeners once again, we want to come and see you for some sound financial advice. You've been doing it well for 32 years. Where can we find you?
We're based at 204 Academy Road in Hastings. We've got it's a black basalt stone building with a big tartan logo. You can't miss it.
Can't. As was a pleasure, Nick. Look after yourself. We'll talk to you same time, same place next time.
Thank you.